And if we go to 2.1.2 in your summary, that is where you say that in the case of sexual harassment, these gender relations of power can become complexly intertwined. Can you explain that for us slowly?
Sure. So we have, I think, already what we can call gendered power relations that tend to structure relations between men and women in a particular way. I've outlined some of those. Men advance, propose, women accept, whatever. So you've already got that kind of relationship. And I think it's also a power relationship in the sense that, there are many examples of it. The Constitution has tried to address it. We speak often of gender inequality, which manifests in a range of ways. Workplace is one, in that you will find who performs what work. And this is precisely why we have things like employment equity and affirmative action in order to address this. Who does what work is very gendered. So if you walk into a garage, for example, you will find that most mechanics are men. It will be unusual to find women mechanics. If you walk into an office and you look at who are the secretaries, they will predominantly be the women. If you look at who are the CEOs and the senior managers, they will predominantly be men. So you have that kind of structuring in terms of who holds positions, who is likely to hold what position, and what kind of qualities we associate with women's positions. So secretary is often there to serve, to make coffee, to make tea. I'm speaking now obviously in very general terms. Is supposed to be doing the service side. Women are more typically, or anybody else is in a subordinate position, there to listen and to carry out instructions. So you have that kind of, you bring in the gendered social relations, and then you see how gendered relations also inform workplace structures. Then workplaces obviously have their own sets of hierarchies. In order for people to do their work, clearly those who are in positions of authority need to be able to have the authority to be able to instruct in order to be able to ask people to do work. And if people do not do work, to take the necessary steps to ensure that they do the work. So we have these complex, in terms of labor law, what do you do in terms of disciplining, instructing, the consequences of not performing, etc. So you have those who can instruct and who can't instruct. Hence your ideas about insubordination, because you are not obeying instructions, for example. So workplaces are quite clearly structured they are hierarchical, because you need to have that kind of relationship, and they are more or less hierarchical. Some are extremely hierarchical. If you look at the police, for example, that is command and control. It is instruction, the same with the military. But you wouldn't quite find that kind of degree of control in your everyday workplace, for instance. But nonetheless, there is still an authority structure because of the nature of work and what needs to be done. So you have those kinds of relationships, and it's why we have workplace law, is to be able to set out who is overstepping the authority, who is disregarding authority. So, and with that, you also have your things like your job descriptions in order to set out who is required to do what, so that again we can get into these questions of, I can instruct you to do this because your job is required. This is your job, or I don't have to do this because this is not part of my job. So workplaces, different industries have different norms, but they are very structured in terms of how do you work, who does what, who says what, who listens, who obeys, what are the sanctions. So that is why it can become quite complicated once you're dealing with sexual harassment, because saying no to somebody who is your senior is difficult. Firstly, it is an inversion of the relationship as to who directs or instructs and who follows instructions. So for a junior person to tell a senior person, it can be a very difficult thing to do precisely because there is that inversion. The other thing is, what are the consequences of me saying no to somebody who holds a higher position in the hierarchy than I do? If I say no, I am their junior, will they take me seriously? And what are the consequences? Can this person victimize me? Can they make my work uncomfortable? Can they ask me to go and start doing work that I don't want to do? Can they start taking away workplace opportunities from me? Can they start speaking to me in a way that is extremely uncomfortable and makes my work miserable? So this is where it starts to get uncomfortable because you now have not just the operation of the informal social relationship of gender, but you now have a structured relationship upheld by law that sets out this is how you will relate to each other. This is a workplace. This is who says this and who does this and who does that. So that is why it becomes very difficult. But I think one must also think in relation to sexual harassment and power relations. You have your structured relations and what we would call formal power. So formal power will obviously be where you have your organogram. It's formalized. This is your position. This is your position. This is what you do. This is what you do. It's set out. It's formalized. But then I think when you look at sexual harassment between peers, it's important to realize that power is very much more complex than just a question of position.
But in this instance, we are working with definite different power relations. There's a vast difference between the judge president and the judge's secretary. Is that correct?
Very definitely. And I think there is also a situation here where, obviously, if you're talking about power, there are layers of power. So you can talk about someone's immediate line manager. That's the person who has direct control over them. So in this case, as I understand it, Judge Mbenenge would not have been the line manager, and courts, as I understand them, and I stand to be corrected, don't quite have that kind of arrangement. You have a judge who's not necessarily somebody's line manager, but nonetheless, the secretary works or is not necessarily directly employed by the judge, but that's who they work for. That's who they take their instruction from, and they work for that person. So you have multiple, from what I can see of the courts, they have multiple layers of hierarchy. So you have your judge, who you may be immediately working for, but then you have somebody who's at the apex, a judge president, who is responsible not just for that particular court, but for the entire province. So it's a little bit like, in a company, you have your line manager and then there's the CEO. The CEO might not be your direct line manager, but you still would not be rude to the CEO. That person is the most senior person. So I think this is where it's important to think about other dimensions of power beyond just the formal that I spoke to you about. There's also the questions of influence. So even if somebody doesn't directly manage you, they can influence, again, you can see this university, they can influence your career progression. If that person carries a lot of status and credibility, and I think this is the other important thing to look at, is how position confers other aspects of power, which include things like status and credibility. Who is more likely to be believed? Who has the higher status? Who will be seen as being more credible? Whose word will carry more weight? Even if you have influence, if somebody, I'll use a university example. You might not be employed by that particular person, but that lecturer or that faculty head can tell others in other universities, even if they just need to say something like, because people will say, well, can you recommend that person? What do they like to work with? I would be very careful. They don't work so well. You're not necessarily giving somebody a formal reference, but you have influence. People come and ask you, what do you think? And your opinion will count and hold weight. So one can also exercise that kind of power and influence so that even if you've never said anything, you can still have an effect on somebody's career and their career progression. The classic example, if we can use legal examples, is the candidate's attorney. They're not employed by the law firm, but if they and when I've seen cases like this, if they lay a charge of sexual harassment, those are all senior lawyers who can make their progression and their lives and their careers going forward quite difficult, just because of what they can say and the kind of influence, clout, and weight that they have. So I think it's also important to look at those dimensions of power in addition to having formal positional power.